right? It would not be right if we continued and didn't pay any attention to those for whom this is really a life or death issue, basically, in their lives. And I'm not sure we're going to be able to hear from all of them now, but we'll do some. And as the afternoon progresses, it would be lovely to be able to hear from each one of them. Victor, just step forward a minute, would you? I think you struggled with your gender, is that right?
Yes.
So what happened? What was the issue, and what started to move you on in your life?
I think the issue was that I never had good role models in my childhood, and then also in teenage life. I always only had these toxic friendships with young males much older than me, and I would just do whatever they say, because I also had huge problems with depression, with self-esteem, with bullying, and it just distorted my view about masculinity, about how I was viewing the males in my life back then.
So what was the turning point for you?
The turning point for me was when I became a Christian, and I understood that what God has to say about masculinity and about being a man, and that what society has to be about being a man is completely different than what God has to say about that. And it's not only about your muscles or about how macho you are, but it's about your character. It's about your feelings. It's about being a man is not that you have to be insensible or So I just stepped into what God has to say about me, not what society says about me or my past traumas and issues have to say about me.
And then you visited a TV studio, I think, and things went in a completely different direction.
Yes, there is this TV station in Romania. They saw my testimony because it went viral in my country, and they called me to testify their life in their studio. Yes, and that started my journey practically.
And Victor's working for us now for more than a year, and it's been an absolute pleasure and a joy working with him. But Kieran, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us a little bit of your story.
So I was raised in a Sikh family, and I thought I was born gay. I just thought it was my right to pursue this lifestyle because I felt this kind of feelings as I was quite young. And then probably pretty much from age 18 up until 4 years ago, I encountered the gospel message. The power of God just released me from homosexuality, completely delivered me. I don't crave that lifestyle, I don't miss it. I'm a much more happier, joyful person since I've encountered Christ and the love of God. It's completely changed my life, and I'm just in awe of what God has done for me.
Thank you so much. And Rob, how's it been going for you in life? Because I know you came down to London and started living the gay life. Is that right? What happened?
I moved to London in 2014 because I had same-sex attraction and I was a Christian, but I found it very frustrating and isolating in church, and I realised the feelings weren't going away. So I lived in London for a bit, and actually I found it was more frustrating because of the rejection, the constant search for perfection from other gay men, how they always, well not always, but mostly cheat, they're in open relationships, they're promiscuous, there's drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and this is all made worse by the fact that none of this is ever talked about in the media. It's just presented as this rosy picture of perfect happiness. So in the end I ended up getting anxiety and panic attacks, and I resisted God's call back to him for a while, but in the end I came back because I had the worst panic attack in my life and I felt like I was going to die. And I realised that same-sex relationships are not God's will, and it's rebellion against God. If you carry on then it will be your fault and you will have to answer to him, and literally you go to hell. This is what God showed me. And in his grace I repented and turned back to Jesus Christ, and I'm following him now, and my life is much better.
Much better. So, not finished yet. Something in process. You're on a journey. I think that's what we're saying here. We're not going to have time to speak to you right now, Tia, but I know you struggled with suicide. And I know, Christian, you had a really rough upbringing. And I would love to share also with what, Brian, you've been through in your life. So we'll do that in a few minutes' time. But thank you, and God bless you, each one of you. It's a personal pleasure for me to be introducing Dr. Peter May, long-time friend and supporter, and somebody who has done so much, I think, for our movement in terms of what he writes and how he argues. Peter May trained in medicine in London and worked as a family doctor in Southampton for 30 years. He's been an outspoken critic of unscientific alternative therapies and fraudulent healers. In retirement, he co-authored with Dermot O'Callaghan the Core Issues Trust book, Beyond Critique, the Misuse of Science by UK Professional Mental Health Bodies. He was a member of the Church of England's General Synod for 25 years, and he and his wife Heather have just celebrated their golden wedding anniversary. They have 4 children and 16 grandchildren. Well done, Peter.
Thank you, Mike. I'm not altogether sure it's 16 grandchildren. I haven't counted for several days. You'll be pleased to know this is, I take a slightly different approach to things. I want to tell you a story rather than give you a whole lot more statistics and facts to wrestle with. And many of the things, the important points have been so well flagged up already. Sexuality is in crisis. Where has the science been? It seemed to go missing. It is a very strange world we're now in, where you can choose your own gender, but are prevented from choosing the direction of your desires. Professor Michael King died in September, and he was a key player in these sexuality debates. A psychiatrist and epidemiologist in the Faculty of Brain Sciences at University College London, his research interests included the role of religious beliefs in mental well-being and the stress and stigma faced by homosexuals. A gay man himself, and a professing Christian, he entered a civil partnership in 2006 and gay marriage in 2017. As a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, he chaired the college's special interest group in homosexuality. And in 2012, he oversaw the production of the college submissions to the Church of England's Pilling Commission and the Home Office consultation on equal civil marriage, as well as various college position papers that came out from time to time on sex and gender. He also produced a briefing paper for members of the Church of England's General Synod before their 2017 debate supporting Joan Azan's motion calling for a ban on conversion therapy. This was a poor debate. Having sat through 25 years of synod debates, this one really didn't rate. It seemed that very few people had a grip of the issues that were being thrown around. Jesus talked clearly. Have you not read that in the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and that a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? And what therefore God has joined together, man must not separate. But Jesus continued, and this part of it is, I think, very important. He said, not everyone can accept this teaching. Only those to whom it's given. Well, who are they? Surely his disciples, those who hear his voice and choose to follow him and put their faith in him into practice in their lives. These sexuality issues are non-negotiable core issues for Christian people. And even when we fail, Christians know that we're called to be faithful to our wives, to nurture our own children, to care for the weak and the elderly. And every Christian knows that the family unit is fundamental to human flourishing. If the Church of England's bishops do not teach these things, their flock will continue to look elsewhere for faithful leaders. But in King's view, sexual orientation was not a choice. He believed its causes were biological in nature, determined by genetic factors and hormones in the womb. He was adamant there's no good evidence to show that the nature of parenting or a history of early childhood abuse had any role in shaping sexual orientation. Once formed, he maintained it could not be changed. It was innate. And to attempt to change it was both unethical and potentially harmful. This false dogma, propagated by the Royal College of Psychiatrists, was a major public argument in the campaign to legalise gay marriage. King was highly influential, and he brought into being a memorandum of understanding calling UK mental health bodies to prohibit counsellors from practising what they chose to call conversion therapy. King chose to call in the memorandum. The definition of such conversion therapy has been an ongoing source of contention. It's clearly true that some 50 years ago, appalling therapies were available, and people, because homosexual acts were against the law, they were coerced into taking whatever help they could find. But since the 1970s, the only therapies that have been available in the National Health Service have been conversational therapies, where skilled counsellors can explore their clients' hopes and fears and support them in achieving their own chosen desires and outcomes. In April 2013, my colleague Dermot O'Callaghan and I wrote on behalf of Core Issues Trust and enclosed a copy of the book that Mike just mentioned. We wrote to Professor Sue Bailey, who was president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, seeking clarification on numerous matters of concern to us. We claimed the college submission to the government was founded on gay ideology rather than science, and it was written by an author with undeclared interests, distorting science to achieve political ends. These were very serious accusations. We concluded our letter by saying, we do not want to misrepresent the college. We realise these matters have international implications, and many doctors and therapists look to the college for guidance and leadership. We want to give you the opportunity to respond before we take matters further. We'd be very happy to meet with you and discuss these issues if that would be helpful. Professor Bailey did not reply at all. Some 2 months later, we had a letter from the college registrar, Dr. Lawrence Miners-Wallace, saying, I do not propose to enter into a discussion about sexuality. Surely this silencing of debate was an early sign of our current deplatforming cancel culture. So in 2015, following a campaign by the General Medical Council to encourage NHS whistleblowers to speak up when they encountered unprofessional behaviour, we took our grievances to them. claiming that the college had an ethical obligation to address serious matters of scientific dispute raised in their own publications. The GMC replied, "It's unfortunate that the doctors have been unwilling to engage in discourse. And we understand this may be frustrating. We appreciate that you're dissatisfied with the contents of the reports, in particular that they may have influenced policy making. But the GMC is not the appropriate forum for dealing with these matters, and we will not be taking any further action." If not the GMC, who else? They made no other suggestion as to who we should turn to. So if we have misunderstood the college's statements, it was not without a serious attempt of clarification as to what they meant and what the science was that they were relying on. The major issues of concern have been mapped out for us today, but they include that orientation is, if it is biological and innate, why do studies of identical twins not support this? Why has extensive genetic research not found any evidence of a gay gene? Secondly, it is common that adolescents experience a phase of emotional or physical attraction to members of their own sex. If this happened to, say, 40% of teenagers, it seems that only 1 or 2% develop any settled homosexual orientation. Thirdly, there's been a growing body of evidence that many adults are attracted to both sexes. This was shown in the Ipsos Mori poll, for instance, this year in February. Does this sexual fluidity, especially common in those under 25 years of age, not mean that such adolescence, assuming adolescence continues to about the age of 25, which I think is certainly the driving insurers believe that people behave differently under the age of 25. Does it mean that such adolescents have a real choice as to the way they go forward? The college position statement of April 2014 stated, "There is no evidence to impute any kind of choice into the origins of sexual orientation. There is no sound scientific evidence that sexual orientation can be changed." So fourthly, does that mean that there's no sound scientific evidence that it cannot be changed? Fifthly, when I was a medical student, we were taught that brain development was completed around the age of about 21. But over the past generation, there's been increasing recognition that the brain is in fact plastic, meaning that its nerve pathways and connections are not fixed and set, but go on developing and are moulded even into old age. Learning to play a musical instrument, learning a new language, developing any new skills, they're all very much easier to do in early adult life, but they can still be achieved even after retirement. Such things do not happen overnight, but occur with practice and perseverance over a long passage of time. Why has there been no public discussion about the role of neuroplasticity in retraining and redirecting sexual responsiveness? Would cognitive behavioral therapy not be of help? And by the same mechanism, is not pornography highly destructive? Sixth, in exploring the stories of homosexual people experiencing, many of them experience physical absence or emotional distance from their same-sex parent. This is very common. And this lack of affection affirmation, bonding, role modelling for the same-sex parent appears to find compensation for some anyway in same-sex relationships. This is described very powerfully in celebrity biographies, and I'm thinking now of Elton John and Freddie Mercury, which this was a big factor for them. Elton John didn't even attend the funeral of his father. But also, it's there in the everyday stories of people that we've been collected and put into the X Out Loud booklet. Follow that thread through the book and just see the role of the parental relationships. 7, rewarding sexual behaviours can be very addictive, and pornography is a prime example. Change can occur, but clients need to be well motivated and require ongoing support and encouragement. And as addicts know only too well, the possibility of relapse is a constant reality. The talk of cure is quite inappropriate. I once asked a psychiatrist friend for advice about the prognosis of an abuser who was a spanker. And he replied memorably, in my clinical experience, once a spanker, always a spanker. It evidently provides a particular thrill and gratification. And child abusers can be very resistant to treatment. But aren't these practices much better understood to be rewarding addictive behaviours rather than innate dispositions? 8. In 2003, King himself documented the increased psychological distress experienced within the gay community, their drug and alcohol abuse and their self-harm. He was sympathetic to their needs, but he was stone deaf to the cries of those who wanted help to move away from the gay community for any of many good reasons. 9, finally, I'll stop the list at this point. Is transgender dysphoria acquired, or is that innate? This neglected matter has now become a major social issue. The Royal College of Psychiatrists' winter newsletter of 2019, called The Psychiatric Eye, published an interview with Professor King. The final question was put by Dr. Shakim Shah, was what are the most important areas for future research? And King replied, one of the key things I would do is to understand the natural history of discontent with gender, and feeling that your gender identity is at odds with that assigned at birth. That would be very important. And the other important thing to understand is much more about sexual orientation. It's quite obvious that it's much more of a spectrum than we've hitherto thought. Terrific, isn't it? He goes on, what appears to be coming from the most recent studies of young people is that there's a certain flow and flux along a spectrum. And it's much more likely that sexuality is on a spectrum. It'd be really helpful to understand that many people have sexual responsiveness to the same or other sex, and it doesn't classify them as being a certain type of person for their lives. Our questions in our 2013 book, Beyond Critique, subtitled When Ideology Replaces Science, were clearly on target. And the refusal of the Royal College of Psychiatry even to discuss these issues was a major dereliction of duty on their part. The GMC was impotent to intervene. And now, in the light of King's astonishing volte-face, does the college still believe that orientation is innate? And are the Church of England and the British government still of a mind to join Stonewall's international campaign to ban counselling therapy? And in so doing, to ban freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and freedom of choice? Thank you.
I should say that Dr. Peter May is an executive member of the IFTCC, as is Dr. Karis Mosley. Karis is a public policy analyst and researcher for Christian Concern in the UK, and her expertise is in the interrelationship between Christian theology and ethics and government policy and legislation. She works on the case for free speech and religious freedom over against conversion therapy bans and gender ideology laws in the UK and internationally. She's on the Research Executive Board also of the IFTCC. Very great honour to have you, Karis. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to speak. I hope you're not too tired after lunch. So, as I'm a policy analyst and I'm not a psychologist or a therapist, what can I contribute? I would ask questions about the Coventry University research that the government commissioned and ask you to consider them with me. And I'm aiming this also at policy makers and MPs and people working with MPs and members of the House of Lords. And if you're thinking of talking or writing to those parliamentarians, this might be of interest to you as well. We've already heard a lot of the details, so some of this might sound like a bit of a recap. Okay? So first of all, what is conversion therapy and who decides what it is? And you can see what I'm going to do with these slides is on the left-hand side you'll have the Coventry University Studies claim, and then I'm going to delve into the reality on the right. Okay? So, what the Coventry researchers say, conversion therapy is commonly used as an umbrella term to refer to attempts to modify someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. The word therapy may not accurately reflect the nature of conversion efforts, which may take the form of religious practices rather than using therapeutic approaches. Well, this doesn't tell us very much, because as I think many are familiar by now, the term has a history. The term was coined by an American psychology researcher, Douglas Haldeman, in 1991. Now, it's the history of the research that he uses to do that which is important. His category, conversion therapy, conflated reports of adult male clients who are going of their own accord, their own volition, freely to see a therapist in the USA. It was actually Irving Bieber in New York City. A lot of them had been abused as children or had poor experiences, and they wanted out. And a lot of them had quite a positive experience of therapy. And he conflated and put in the same category studies of homosexual sex offenders in the UK, which was done by the Home Office. And that actually, the study that included that also was problematic. It was a British paper, again conflating different kinds of study in the same way. That's just very poor research practice, I think you would agree. You don't have to be a psychologist researcher to see that. And when you looked in the UK study on offenders, and this is before 1967, before the decriminalisation of same-sex behaviour for men over the age of consent, obviously not all of them had an intrinsic motivation to be there. Some of them, it was required. It was part of a sex offender treatment program. Now that, of course, may sound bizarre and offensive today, but remember that we still have sex offender treatment programs for all kinds of offenders. They've been in the news, they've been controversial, how well they work, but it's something that goes back decades. It's not exclusively tied to same-sex offences. 17% of these UK, we'll call them clients, but they were, offenders or prisoners, would still be classed as sex offenders today because they were offending against minors. So that's important, okay? And these are completely different kinds of people, different motives. I can't be having them all conflated. So the category conversion therapy is a corrupted category. Number two, where does same-sex attraction come from? There's a total lack of curiosity about this in the Coventry Study claim, and yet in the culture, I think people are asking these questions. Just because it's not talked about in the mainstream press doesn't mean it's not of interest to people personally, as we've seen. Yeah, so do I need to press twice? Okay, fine, thanks. Good. You're going to all seat number 2. So yes, this lack of curiosity about the sources and origins is problematic. We just have this statement. Today, same-sex sexual orientations and transgender identities are considered a normal part of human variation. Well, can you have normal and variation in the same sentence? I won't try and answer that. And are not included as mental disorders within the latest edition of the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases. That just talks about the consensus, what one of the speakers called a coercive consensus. That's all that is a summing up. But if we go back, maybe over the last 2 or 3 decades, there used to be this talk about the gay gene and the hunt for it among some scientists. It was only really looking at men, and when it was getting into the press, certainly. It wasn't looking at a lesbian gene. So why is that difference? And also, I think it's impossible to ignore the fact that same-sex sexual orientation and attraction is more common in countries with birth rates below the replacement level. I've never seen a study on this, okay? There's nobody who's actually done a study, random ensemble, but it's quite striking, I think. And so I think a genetic cause is also probably implausible for that reason. And then that changes a lot of things. And policymakers should be questioning what's going on here. Number 3, is transgender identity natural or pathological? Follows on from my last slide. Okay, so the reality, again, there's never really been a hunt for a transgender gene, funny that, and hence no warrant for a claim of normal variation, as in our nature, in our human nature. The scientific literature, others have been able to speak to some of that, higher psychiatric comorbidities. Transgender identification is most common, again, in countries with birth rates below replacement level. Okay, and the same countries have very liberal laws privileging LGBT identities. Some of them probably function as incentives for people to come out and experiment. Number 4, perhaps more personally, why do people seek out therapy or pastoral care? I think it's very striking with the Coventry Study when they list the common reasons, and I'm quoting everything on the left, by the way, are direct quotes, okay? A perceived incompatibility between someone's religious values and their sexual orientation or gender identity. A desire to belong and feel normal within a community. How intrinsic is that motivation? It's really an external motivation. External pressure or coercion by somebody's family members or people from their faith community. Peter mentioned Michael King. Michael King's study of British mental health professionals in the early years of this millennium actually showed that I think it was only 7% of the clients that were remembered by this random sample of professionals, quite a large sample in the UK, had family pressure as the main reason for coming. Okay, so it's not really plausible for the UK. Some people report that while they underwent conversion therapy voluntarily, they feel these choices were shaped by powerful influences in their social environment and under guidance from authority figures. So the impression the Coventry researchers gave you is that it's all really external motivation. But the reality is that they've never asked clearly about intrinsic positive motivations. There can be many, but for example, we should be and could be asking about belief that God created human beings, male and female, and for marriage between one man and one woman only. Feeling that same-sex behavior and feelings is unnatural and violates the design and the form of the human body. That is actually a motivator. It's just not talked about. There's kind of a stigma about even asking about that. Not wanting to live at odds with one's biological sex by going through with gender reassignment. So in this sense, the Coventry Study shares the same flaw with the Faith and Sexuality Survey of the Ozanne Foundation in 2018, which is cited as so-called grey literature by the researchers. Because they're not interested in the positive, life-giving motivations. Oh, that just won't do. How can you form such a policy on ignoring motivation? Then, looking a bit sideways, when did clients start seeking help? And this is a question I've got about history. They say, the Coventry researchers say, that conversion therapy was originally conceived in the early to mid-20th century at a time when homosexuality and transsexualism were considered mental disorders. They were administered by mental health professionals, sometimes by court order. They're referring to criminal courts, like I've mentioned earlier. And they include some of these physical treatments from psychiatry, not therapy, not psychotherapy. The reality is more subtle. I've been looking at the archives of mental health associations, looking at how people were seeking help and how it was offered to them. Talking therapy has been available in the UK, at least in the London area, for the last 100 years. The Wolfenden Committee on Homosexual Offences and Prostitution, convened by the Home Office in the 1950s, therapists turned up to that to give evidence about their clients. Okay, all the major mental health professional bodies, most of the ones, not all, but many of the ones that exist today were in existence then, gave evidence. The Coventry Study, therefore, distorts the history of treatments. They ignore Wolfenden completely. There was no overarching concept of conversion therapy at that time. The word doesn't exist. And I mentioned the offences already. So talking therapy and not physical treatments was the norm. That was one of the big differences between the UK and Germany. Have I gone through the right one? Yeah. So why is there inconsistency about research methods? Obviously, we've heard a lot more detail, so this is not going to be a very long point. The Coventry researchers claim, they complain there's no randomized controlled trials that are being conducted in relation to the effectiveness or harmfulness of conversion therapy. The studies included in the rapid evidence assessment, therefore, fall short of the gold standard in clinical evidence for assessing effectiveness. Okay, that's what they say about the research they've looked at. And then they say it should be noted that it would be practically and ethically difficult to conduct randomized controlled trials on forms of conversion therapy. It's therefore unlikely that there will ever be gold standard evidence upon which to base policy, and this report is based on the best available evidence. Oh dear. They don't seem to want high quality research in the field, because they don't like the idea that other people might be unhappy. And here's a quote from Adam Jowett, the lead researcher. He's the president or the head of the Psychology of Sexuality section of the British Psychological Society, so he's got a lot of influence. So he wrote an article all about these issues in The Conversation, or about sexuality in general, I should say, in 2014. And there's a long comment section where people could respond and interact, and he interacted with his readers. And he said at that point, homosexuality shouldn't be treated because it is not a mental disorder, okay? But not everything, as therapists will tell you, not everything that people go to help for, get help for, is classified as a mental disorder, okay? So we should not choose, this is what he's saying, I don't know who we is, but we should not choose to be straight because there is nothing immoral and loving about loving someone of the same gender. And the basis of sexual orientation is irrelevant because we are humans and deserve human rights. So the basis of where sexual orientation comes from is irrelevant. So we're not interested in questions of truth and origins. And we should not choose to be straight. Now that's, to me, the most fascinating, the most significant phrase in everything that is being said. This is the man who authored and who led the Coventry Study. Who is we? We've heard about how non-LGBT people who have same-sex attraction or gender confusion are not included in the studies, okay? And so who is we, and why is legislation, therefore, being proposed to criminalize the help for those who don't fit into the we, the royal we? Why was so much relevant research ignored? I know we've heard the details, okay, but let's just look at this paragraph here where they explain themselves. The rapid review was conducted to review evidence published from January 2000 to June 2020. That sounds pretty up to date, but... And then it says based on rapid evidence assessment methods and the rapid evidence assessment guidance produced by this Centre for the Civil Service in the UK. Okay? And of course they mentioned the Jones and Yahoo study that some are already familiar with Christians in the US moving away from homosexual behaviour. So they mentioned it but don't want to engage it. The reality is that they also tell us what they excluded from their own literature review, this rapid research. The narrative and systemic literature, books and extracts from books, not very good because reading a book you get a more, perhaps more interaction between some of the statistical work and some of the narratives and the worldview and so on. Studies not published in English, studies published prior to 2000. Like I said, there's over 100 years of people looking into this. Studies that did not provide data that would help answer the research questions. Well, they didn't want to know about intrinsic and positive motivations. So a call for evidence was sent, and this is really important. Who are they talking to? Who did the Coventry researchers ask for help? Because they did have a short period of time, to be fair. They went and used 2 email lists for psychologists. specialising in sexual orientation, gender identity, or LGBT issues. One UK based and one international. Now that seems reasonable. They don't name the mailing lists, which is not right. An email list for UK LGBT health researchers and to representatives of a Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy Working Group. Now this group keeps on changing its name. It was the Coalition Against Conversion Therapy and now it's the MOU group and so on. It's very secretive. It doesn't have a web presence, but the people who are really behind it are the people from Pink Therapy. And Pink Therapy are the group, they were there from the beginning pushing the memorandum. It's probably a foregone conclusion that gender identity is included in the conversion therapy ban in Britain because of them. Okay? So the gender critical movement thinks that you can split off therapy for gender identity from therapy for same-sex attraction. You can't because it's Pink Therapy that's running it. And their template is queer theory. They were the people who really normalised gay affirmative therapy in the UK from the 1990s onwards. And they're also into normalising things like polyamory and sadomasochism and promiscuity. So there we go. They don't like me looking them up. They blocked me on Facebook and I found other ways of looking at what they say. So there we go. They're not deterred by that. Number 8, not long to go. So where's the comparison with similar research? Okay, so most evidence-based recommendations say the Coventry researchers for working therapeutically with LGBT people in distress endorse psychological approaches that provide unconditional acceptance, identity exploration, and social support to help them work through difficult emotions. It's not clear what they mean by unconditional acceptance there. I think it means unconditional acceptance of the feelings and orientation, which is not the same as unconditional acceptance of a person. But the reality is, I would suggest that there is a little-known study by Michael King from 2007 that he co-wrote with colleagues for the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. And I think that that is comparable because it was used to influence the policy of the mental health professional bodies. Now, I apologise in advance, I don't have it up on my slide. I wanted the slide to be neat, but I will put it in this bank that we've got for people who've attended today to look at. But I'll just tell you the title. It's called A Systematic Review of Research on Counselling and Psychotherapy for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender People. I'll come back to that in a minute. The Coventry research was oriented towards sidelining or banning conversion therapy, but so really, in a way, more subtle way, was this 2007 study. The 2007 study was again a meta-study of the available evidence on affirmative therapies and promoting therapies not just for this client niche of people who wanted to live out, gay, lesbian, bisexual and transgender life identity, but for all of training. So I'm going to do a tiny number of quotes from the end from the recommendations. And I regret that this study is not more widely known because it really has shaped the climate that led to all of these policies. So first of all, they did not find this business of gold standard research based on random samples. They did not find that with LGBT affirmative therapy back then. There was little consistent use of standardized measures of outcome. Therapists were mostly highly rated in terms of general satisfaction and perceived helpfulness. Well, that's different from actually helping. Most quantitative studies involve convenient samples of LGBT people, which means the selection bias is likely. The generalizability of existing results to all LGBT people undergoing therapy is questionable. Now, that's a massive finding, okay? But they wanted LGBT affirmative therapists. And they admitted that the research wasn't quite up to scratch. But nevertheless, they made policy recommendations. Okay? And so they said, we would recommend that all psychotherapy training institutes regard knowledge of LGBT development and lifestyle as part of core training, despite not having good enough evidence. What does this actually mean? Heteronormative bias must be recognized and avoided. So queer theory was being made the basis for all of mental health care and all of mental health care training back in 2007. Therapists should increase their knowledge of these issues, and so on. Psychotherapeutic practice that pathologizes homosexuality, bisexuality, and transgenderism should be replaced by more modern understandings of sexual identity. More modern. Okay? So we're not looking at evidence. It's an idea, a set of ideas that supersedes the others. And again, ignoring this non-LGBT client base. So that was Michael King in 2007. And that's the comparable study. Number 9, quickly, Do undercover journalism reports count as evidence? Why am I suddenly throwing that in? That's because the Coventry researchers put it in their section of what they call grey literature. Grey literature not captured in the rapid evidence assessment may provide important sources of evidence, and they include undercover journalist investigations, Paul Brand, Patrick Strudwick, for example. I think everybody in the room is familiar with those. So here's the problem, and I think this is a big issue for the consultation now in England and Wales. Conversion therapy survivor testimonies have been invented by undercover journalists. Am I over-egging the pudding by saying invented? I don't think so. They haven't, mostly, with one exception, they haven't actually released complete recordings to back up the written text in newspapers. These testimonies are the only verifiable evidence, as in having a recording to prove what was said by a therapist or a pastor in the UK. And if you start off by lying and deceiving, and deceiving the therapist, why should you and your campaign expect to be treated seriously? These journalists were offended by words used by therapists or religious leaders because they didn't have the same worldview as the non-LGBT clients or participants in ministries. And so effectively, these journalists or campaigners want a ban based on a supposed right not to be offended. But the Coventry researchers haven't delved into the ethical problem. And finally, credentials. So the Coventry researchers gave their names at the end of this study, and it's published on the government website. They don't give their credentials. They are professional psychologists. But when you look at the Coventry University pages, they've got no research or practical experience prior to this study in this field of change-allowing therapies. Why? Well, I don't want to be too hard on them. The truth is there's no such research expertise in the UK, and I think the reason is the climate created above all by Michael King and by Pink Therapy over the last 14 years. So, the take-home point is good research is open-ended and curious. Propaganda-led research is closed-minded.
We've had Professor Carolyn Piller patiently waiting. She wasn't able to be with us. She couldn't take the time, unfortunately. She's just been with us in Hungary, but she is going to join us online, and she has been involved in some longitudinal research which has now been published and has a particular bearing in terms of the ideas of change and well-being in relation to people who have struggled with same-sex attractions. So there she is. Carolyn, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. We hope we're going to see a big picture of you at some point. We're seeing a little one right now, but you're so welcome, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for the introduction, and I like it that you see just a little picture of me, so let's just keep it that way. I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to share about the study and about some of the background of the study that I think is particularly pertinent to this symposium. I'll be presenting some information from the study. We conducted the study demonstrating that safety is safe. The study is titled Sexual Attraction, Fluidity, and Well-Being in Men, a Therapeutic Outcome Study. And I co-authored it with Dr. Philip Sutton. I'll be focusing in particular on the portion of the study examining well-being as it pertains closely to the theme of this symposium. If you're curious about additional information from the study, you can access it on the Journal of Human Sexuality's website, free. So it's readily available, and I'll be referring to it later on. And again, not in complete detail. So you can, if you want the details, you can find it there. So on my title slide here, you might be curious about this term that we use to describe what goes on in therapy. We have rejected the language that is being used as and used as a term for what is happening in therapy. In fact, I think that this term, sexual attraction, fluidity, exploration in therapy, or safety, is exactly what's going on in therapy, as opposed to any of the other pejoratives that are used when the political activists are engaged with this this conversation, and when in this case as well. So the term safety is what I'll be using for the remainder of the presentation. The research question that I'll be discussing is what happens to the well-being of adult men who are allowed the autonomy and self-determination to explore sexual attraction, fluidity, and therapy. We all know the dominant narrative, the dominant oppressive narrative, that if people autonomously explore their sexual attraction potential, they will be harmed. But there really is no empirical evidence to support this. So I'm going to be talking about what motivated the research, what the evidence behind the study is that indicates that we would probably find an increase in well-being of these men, and then I'll present the results of this particular study. So whenever you begin a research study, you need to have a clear idea of the problem you're addressing. There are several problems. They're all interrelated, and I'm going to present 3 of them here. Most of the professional associations in the U.S. have some level of limitations of self-determination for this very specific group of clients, that is, those who desire to expand their sexual attraction potential. Well, we see that this is a problem. Any limitations on the autonomy of clients, especially a specific minority group of clients, as in this case, raises red flags for me, and I believe it should for any ethical practitioner. When there is a single group that is legislation is coming against them having just the normal agency that we would give to any other client, there's some concerns. So we recognized that maybe there needs to be some more evidence of what happens in therapy. So the evidence that we have that's been presented so well, these professional associations have built their practice standards on substandard research by their own admission. We even look at the gay affirmation therapy, the therapy used to attempt to discredit safety, and we can find by the APA claims that there really isn't enough evidence to tell us that safety is safe. The APA and others criticize the current literature, but rather than calling for additional research, as Karis just mentioned, they've chosen to limit the autonomy of clients who would choose to pursue safety. So rather than the normal approach for a lack of evidence, they're rather than calling for more research, which would be a normal response, they're limiting research. They're calling to limit it. And we didn't agree with that choice. And so we decided that we should continue to explore this question. So this is the third issue that I'm bringing up. It really is the result of the professional organization's limitations on therapy and research. People who are legislators have to depend on the professional organizations. They depend on, and somewhat the cultural narrative, and in order to make decisions. And that's why we're here. We're hoping to shed some light on some issues that probably have been kept in the dark for too long. We can see this all over the world. Legislators are being influenced to create laws that limit the rights of only this specific group of people to set their therapy goals, to center their agenda. That alone should be a cause for questioning. So before starting our study, we had a pretty good idea that providing therapy that promotes self-determination and autonomy would have a positive effect on the well-being of the participants. This is supported with a body of empirical research that applies self-determination theory to counseling and psychotherapy. There is so much evidence that this should actually promote well-being as opposed to produce harm. And actually, what I'm going to give you some highlights of the self-determination theory applied to psychotherapy before I present what we found. And what you're going to see is that, in fact, our study and this past research makes it clear that if you limit client autonomy, you will cause harm. That is where the harm is happening. So we know from this body of research, and again, you will be able to access the reference page for this presentation through the bank that is made available. We know that clients who have supported, who are supported in pursuing their self-determined and value congruent therapeutic goals are more likely to experience lasting change and positive therapeutic experiences and an increase in well-being. These positive outcomes are consistent in this research. Anytime that you support them, you center them, you understand and value the client's agenda, they will experience an increase in well-being. When the therapeutic goals are related to establishing congruence with core identity, with core values, the need for autonomy is increased. Privileging the client's agenda and protection of their freedom to self-regulate is at the heart of safety. That is what it's about. That is why it's so important for us to understand that if we limit these efforts for these people to set their own agenda in therapy, we are going to cause harm. Privileging the client's agenda and protecting their freedom is what we have to do. So client self-determination in psychotherapy is dependent on the therapist's support of autonomy. So what we're having with these professional organizations who are creating guidelines for therapists. Again, these therapists depend on these professional organizations to tell them what to do. We see that in any professional field. Medical organizations are struggling with that right now. Doctors are trying to get information from their medical organizations about how to respond to the pandemic. We see this where there's no time. We're in the clinicians are in the therapy room, depending on these outside organizations to give them some good guidance. Well, when the guidance is not centering the client's agenda, that's a problem. We know that understanding the client's core values, centering the client's core values is going to increase well-being, communicating empathy. And what this research has found is that offering as many choices as possible within the context of the therapeutic setting is essential for increasing well-being. Limiting their choices by saying things like, well, this is just obviously internalized homophobia. And so, or my practice guidelines say that I can't help you with that. Or as the APA has hinted in the past, well, really what you need to do is just get a different religion. That's your problem. So we need to continue to understand that this well-being is essential for people to get healthier, and well-being is diminished with the isolation of people from their own agenda. The support of self-determination has been demonstrated to be powerful in and of itself. Just the initial support of client goals, isolated from any achievement of those goals, leads to increased well-being, and it's followed by a greater ability to sustain the pursuit of that goal. Autonomy support from the clinician may even have a greater impact on the outcome of therapy than a positive therapeutic alliance. We've had research for years trying to find out what the difference the difference in a positive therapeutic experience. And we found that it's the therapeutic alliance more than even the techniques that are used, more than the training of the therapist. It's that therapeutic alliance that makes the difference. Well, this autonomy support is thought to be one of the main factors in creating that positive therapeutic alliance. And it's important to, as they take apart, what determines, what are these factors that make a client feel like they're safe in this place. And the autonomy support is one of the main factors. Conversely, limiting the client's autonomy will not only diminish the effectiveness of therapy, but it will create a therapeutic environment that is conducive to harm. When therapeutic goals are controlled by someone or something else, such as legislation, the client will experience increased anxiety and lowered self-esteem. They will experience decreased well-being and a loss of internal locus of control. When a clinician tries to talk a client out of their internal locus of control, this is conducive to harm. This is a quote from a couple of the researchers who have applied self-determination theory to counseling practice and psychotherapy practice that I think is important in this discussion. Promoting patient choice through the clarification of values and goals, and facilitating growth through methods that emphasize ownership, personal responsibility, and awareness is thus an orientation that is not only allied with many of the traditional values of the therapeutic community, it is an empirically grounded approach to lasting change. Yet, to be effective, it also requires therapists themselves being aware of their motives and protecting clients from controlling systems of incentives and pressures that can contaminate the process and climate of therapy. So this is how I find myself as just a clinician, just a researcher in a situation like this, where I am involved in public policy discussions. And it's because this is the only way that I can attempt to protect my clients from these controlling systems that I am clearly aware of causing harm. So you might be confused at this point. After all, isn't there research that demonstrates that safety is harmful? Of course, you've been hearing about this all day, so I won't go into too much detail of this, but I do want to highlight some things that are very appropriate for presenting before I show you what I found in our study. There are problems specific to research attempting to discredit safety. Many, if not most, of the research reporting outcomes for individuals exploring sexual attraction fluidity include investigations of the effects of non-psychotherapeutic experiences. Not that there's any problem, I'm not asking you to dismiss those, but the problem is that these studies are on non-psychotherapeutic experiences such as support groups, religious and educational interventions, and they're often quite clear that they're not about psychotherapy. These studies are, I don't know if the Blosnick et al. 2020 study has been mentioned yet today, but they come right out and say 81% of the participants in their study took part exclusively in religiously mediated interventions, not psychotherapy, and yet the study is used to published as if the results represent the results of psychotherapy. So we have this continued theme. Most studies combine measures of psychotherapy and non-psychotherapy. Many studies are representing these results, and they're being published as if they represent psychotherapy outcomes. So this is an interesting phenomenon. The studies are often about interventions, or at least that's what they're attempting to report, is about interventions. But these interventions that we hear about are interventions, historically harmful techniques, such as recovered memory, aversion techniques, rebirthing, misuse of electroconvulsive therapy. All of these have been long discredited. They are not used in therapy. We already have legislation against harmful practices in therapy, so there's no need for that. But there's this hint that that's what this therapy is about. And in fact, really what the legislation is about is not about these techniques. These techniques are already taken care of. We already have practice guidelines around there. No one is confused about that. These legislative efforts are actually about the treatment goals, limiting the autonomy and self-determination of people. Some of this research, by the way, that the APA used as a foundation for their first set of guidelines on LGB, and it still echoes through the APA documentation, as foundationally biased. You may have mentioned, I don't know, previously today, the Shidlow and Schroeder study that was done. And they advertised for participants. They recruited participants with this poster that says, "Help us document the harm." So they went into areas where they thought they could find a large population of LGB clients or participants for their study who had been clients in psychotherapy. And they only recruited people who had experienced harm in psychotherapy. And then that was represented as, well, this is harmful. And you know, my freshman research methods students could see the flaw in this, but this was published. This was used as part of the informants of guidelines. Virtually all safety research is retrospective, and not that there's a problem with retrospective research. Virtually all of it is qualitative in terms of the safety research that's specifically about what happens with safety. And again, those are good ways to ask these questions and explore them, but some of them are based on decades old memories. So retrospective means that you ask people to look back and, you know, tell you what happened to them 30, 40, maybe 50 years ago now. And then this is good information, but you shouldn't be creating clinical guidelines on this type of research. And that is just what has been happening. So this leads me to talking about the study that we conducted. And this is the big question that we're talking about today: is safety safe? With the study, we answered questions about efficacy and beneficence of therapy for men who want to explore their sexual attraction fluidity. We wanted to know what happens in a real-life clinic when clients are allowed to exercise self-determination, autonomy. Will they experience sexual attraction fluidity, and will they experience improved well-being? We're not talking about the fluidity today. Indeed, they did, but I'm going to let you look at the study yourself and read about that part. Today, I'm just going to be talking about the well-being issue. Again, the entire study can be found on the Journal of Human Sexuality website. This is just a brief view of the study design. It was a single group design, and we set it up quasi-experimental, which meant that it was single group, not randomly assigned, because we valued looking into what is really happening in these clinics, not some laboratory in a university, but what everyday clinic where people are being offered the opportunity to explore their sexual attractions. What's happening there? And by the way, there's a movement toward research that is taking place in a clinical setting, in a natural setting, and I hope we see more of that in the future. But we observed real life clients in this clinical setting. It has more generalizable results than if we had randomly assigned them or if we had manipulated their experiences. We measured the clients over a period of time. Each participant was measured for 2 years on their well-being and their sexual attraction fluidity, and it was prospective, which, I would say that it is the first of this type of study where we are looking at the people in real time, and we're measuring in real time as opposed to asking them to look back, and we're gathering empirical evidence of what happens. So we asked for permission to recruit participants from new clients at a couple of clinics in California. The researchers, I was not affiliated with these clinics in any way. I wasn't an employee, a contractor. I just wanted to be a fly on the wall. The intent of the design was to allow observation of real-life client experiences in a clinical setting. And so we received this permission. We recruited male adults reporting same-sex attraction experiences and a desire to explore their sexual attraction fluidity. They were given all of the opportunity to participate in the study or not participate in the study that we would in any other setting. Potential participants were assured that their participation in the study or even declining to participate would have no impact on their clinical services. So there were separate consent forms for their clinical services and the research. We had a research assistant who was embedded at the clinics that helped us with this process, able to explain the study and answer any questions one-on-one. So these folks that we recruited looked like this. There were 75 men. 69% of them were 18 to 35 years old. So we did have some men all the way up into their 70s, but maybe one or two. Most of the men were young men. 57% of them were Roman Catholic. 66% attended religious services at least one time a week. 24% a few times per week, and 25% were not religious or perhaps atheists. We had some those who claimed to be atheists. And then the last point is 83% of them were white. But in regard to the religiosity of this group, there are folks who have said, well, gosh, these people are really religious. This is not very generalizable. But we would argue that, these are actually the people that are showing up. So these are the people that are asking for help, assistance to explore their sexual attraction fluidity. So these are the folks that you see doing that. And it would make sense that people who have a core set of values, that their core identity is based on their relationship to God, and that's who they are, that those would be the people who would want to have everything in alignment with that and would seek help with that. Here are some of the reasons that they wanted to explore their potential toward opposite sex attraction. In particular, this is what they were hoping for, is to grow their opposite sex attraction. 37% said it was because they wanted to marry a woman. They wanted a traditional family. They wanted to get married and have children. And 30% cited religious reasons. 23% was a combination, including those two, the previous two, and a desire to improve their psychological well-being, a quest for value congruency. And then we hear a lot about this 7% and 3% as if they're the majority. Now, I'm not sure if these people would really fall into being coerced or feeling coerced, but they could. These might be people who are like, yeah, I'm feeling a lot of pressure. This 10% of people, they could be in therapy for because they feel like some external pressure. But the other 90% of the folks in this group had intrinsic desires to explore this. This is what we measured well-being with. So the OQ 45.2 outcome questionnaire 45.2. It's a 45-question instrument administered through an online testing center. It's very quick and easy to administer. It's norm reference. It detects changes even in short-term therapy. So even we can tell, like, it's meant to be used on a weekly therapy session by therapy session basis. It has good reliability, validity. It's been used internationally. It measures improvement and deterioration within three client functions: psychological, interpersonal, and social. The scores are the higher the score, the more distress, and the lower the score, the lower the distress. So, and following the recommendations of the instrument publishers, we used for our study results the first and the last measurements, even though we were taking measurements all along. So this is a question that people ask a lot. What happened in therapy? What was the intervention? And so the clinicians who provided these services used reintegrative therapy, RT. It's described as a specific combination of evidence-based mainstream treatment interventions for trauma and addiction. So it includes things like EMDR, mindful self-compassion, and other trauma therapies that are coming out. And it emphasizes, one of the things that RT is noted for is its emphasis on the client's self-determination and autonomy, supporting safety. While the standard RT treatment protocol was designed for treating trauma and addictions, therapists at these clinics report observations of this co-occurring reduction and in same-sex attraction experiences in some men and increase in opposite-sex attractions. This took place, as I said, in these real-life clinics, and so the time in treatment varied. It was just whatever wouldn't be normally their treatment protocol, their treatment length was whatever was appropriate for that client, as opposed to in a laboratory setting where they would be receiving this many sessions and everyone would have the same experience. So here are the results. We did a t-test, performed a t-test to find the difference between the pre-test score and the post-test score. And we found a statistically significant difference. So remember, the higher the score, the more the distress, the lower the score, the greater the well-being. So when these folks left therapy, they were clearly statistically significantly improved in their well-being with a large effect size. And further, the pre-test and post-test difference was 16.71. So 16.71 points. This exceeded the OQ 45.2 reliable change index of 14 points, the RCI, the reliable change index. A change that is equal to or greater than the reliable change index of any given instrument indicates that the change is a true change in the client's clinical condition and that it is probably a lasting change. Additionally, the post-test mean of 54.56 was well below the OQ 45.2 clinical cutoff level of 63 points. In other words, anything at 63 points and above, indicates that these people need help, that they're experiencing such distress that they need clinical intervention, they need psychotherapy. Well, by the time they left, you can see they were well below that. All of these findings indicate both a statistically significant and a clinically significant change in the well-being scores of these participants. And safety results in a remarkable improvement in well-being for men who are seeking sexual attraction fluidity. Therapeutic choice results in improved well-being. Thank you.
So Carolyn, has she gone?
No,
Carolyn,
I'm here.
that's great. Maybe there would be some questions for you. Would that be all right?
Sure.
Are there any questions? Just to say that Carolyn's paper is in your pack. So that's one of the ones you have, Ella and Sutton's paper. Any questions or comments? Fine, go ahead, Christopher. Just for time, we'll come back to you.
Hi, Carolyn. It's Christopher.
Hi,
Good to see you. You're looking brighter than I am. But I wonder if you wanted to tell us just a little bit about the backstory about trying to get this published. Would that be too dramatic for you? Just I think people would find that very interesting.
Right, and I kind of lost track of how many journals we submitted it to, but it was kind of the same process with each submission, where we would submit it and we would get some feedback, either with, well, if you do these changes, we'll consider it again. You may resubmit, and so the reviewers would have comments like, well, this design is not perfect, basically. Well, there's nothing we can do about that. That's a done deal. So we can't rewrite anything on that. But interestingly, the design was, the first empirical perspective design that had been out there. So compared to other research on this topic, it was what we thought was a little bit of an improvement, at least. So that was interesting. And then we would go through this process, and then we go to another journal or another set of reviewers, and they would give us the exact opposite feedback. In other words, change your article back to where it was in the beginning. They didn't know what the other people had said. So in other words, and it just kept going around and around and around until I finally realized, this is not going to happen. And we would have a couple of editors who said, for me to publish something like this that gives these results, it has to be bulletproof. This study has to be absolutely perfect, and it's not. Well, and that's because there are no perfect studies. But they weren't willing to take the risk that it would be, because they've seen what happens to other journal editors who have published unpopular scientific evidence of people not being harmed through safety. So then finally, I got the wonderful editor of the Journal of Human Sexuality and to be interested in the article, and it got published.
One more question.
That last interaction actually plays into what I was about to ask or comment. Basically, the weight of information that we've heard today, it makes one feel that whole scientific process is broken down. I'm not just referring to the topic of this symposium, but the same kind of things are happening related to COVID and vaccines, global warming. There's a whole raft of very politically charged areas that seem to be where the whole scientific process of publishing and review and just focusing on evidence and going where the evidence leads, it seems to be in disarray and being unduly influenced by other factors, other forces. What's your feeling about that? Do you feel that that's something that is a passing phase, or is it recoverable? Or what are the ways that that situation can be improved?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, that's funny that you would mention the COVID issue. I'm very interested. I read a lot of the research coming out on how to optimize our health and how many of the interventions that governments are kind of deciding on without evidence for protecting people are actually ending up harming people. So I was thinking, what an interesting parallel this is. But I don't know if it's new. I have a suspicion, and of course I haven't scrutinized it, historically, as I have this. But I have a suspicion that the cultural agenda has always influenced science, and whatever cultural agenda influences practice in therapy. It influences practice in medicine. I don't know if it's new. I do think it's probably more blatant and more in your face than it ever has been. I mean, they're not even trying to be tricky. It's pretty evident, though, that it's gone on for a long time, and it's one of the things that we see when we study research methods, and that there are so many flaws in the process, and the cultural agenda certainly is privileged above science very frequently.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Thank you, Carolyn. Well done.
Sure.
And we're very proud of the work that you've done, and
Aww.
Carolyn is also an executive member of the IFTCC. So thank you for your interest, Carolyn,
Yes.
and for the work that you do. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Is Tia here? Tia, just come up for a minute, would you? Because I can't let this go away. Because you really got to a very low point in your life. Tell us what happened and how you began to climb out of that.
I was living a gay lifestyle. I was out to my family, everybody knew, and for many years it led me to drinking every day. I became a chain smoker, clubbing. So the more I did that, I was in a committed relationship with a woman. The more I did that, the more it made me feel empty inside. And I started to feel suicidal, panic attacks, depression. And in 2017, January, I was seriously thinking of killing myself because I was empty inside. I had everything in my life. And yet it was so unfulfilling and empty, I cannot explain it. And I cried out to God, and that's when I encountered God.
Now, I just have to ask you this question. So how come you didn't seek a counselor or a therapist?
I didn't know there was such help available.
Sorry, folks, did you get that? She didn't realize there was any help available. And I just have to insert this. We're in a bad way in Europe. We are in a serious predicament that we cannot put up the help and the support that we need for people.
Yes, the only thing I knew was to go to a church, and I found my local church, and I told my pastor what was, she wasn't my pastor then, but I told what happened to me, and I need God, and I don't want to be in a same-sex relationship anymore. And that's when my pastor took me under her wings, and she led me through everything.
You're so precious, Tia, and you do us proud. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing to Connect Out Loud. Well, it's really a great joy now to ask Elizabeth Woning to join us. Reverend Elizabeth Woning has a master's degree in theology, is a licensed pastor in North California and co-founder of the Changed Movement. She attended seminary, openly lesbian, before choosing to leave the LGBTQ community and identity. Her work focuses on the intersection of faith with culture pertaining to same-sex sexuality and gender identity. Reverend Woning is an outspoken voice advocating for the legal rights of Christians across the world with same-sex sexual attraction or gender dysphoria to align with their biological sex. She's been married to her husband for 16 years. And Change Movement is a network of people who have left LGBTQ behind because they wanted to. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Well, it's such a privilege to be here with you today, and I am not a scientist, and I don't have any statistics for you. And so you can take a sigh of relief, maybe, and just listen to me as I share a little bit of my story and experiences with men and women who desire to leave the LGBTQ experience behind. Let me just see if I can open my notes. So, as Michael said, I'm here as a pastor and one of countless people who have left LGBTQ identity behind and experienced diminishment of their homosexual feelings so that they can now identify heterosexual or straight. Through Changed, which is an organization that I co-direct with Ken Williams, we'll get to hear from him in just a few minutes. I represent a worldwide network, and right now I can say that there are roughly 1,500 to 2,000 people with whom I'm in connection who have left LGBTQ behind. And so I guess I want to say that as they have pursued changes, their motivation, it varies. They've pursued changes away from same-sex sexual behavior, enough that many of them now today not only identify as heterosexual, but also are married and have children. That's Ken's story. This is a population that most people believe don't exist. I think you might have heard X Out Loud say, "We exist." Now, why is that? Mainly, it's because we have no reason to identify as a specialized people group. I told Michael the other day, I fought hard to identify simply as a woman. And so we identify as heterosexual. We don't make a big deal about it. We now belong as humans in the rest of society. So as a result, all these studies leave us out. Anyone who's benefited from prayer ministries and programs that specifically address unwanted same-sex sexual behaviors have been maybe intentionally or unintentionally excluded from the majority of the studies that are being used to substantiate the harms of so-called change-allowing therapy or conversion therapy. Obviously, one can't go to the LGBTQ community and hear about radical stories of change. And so people never hear about us in the media either. So as a pastor in a large church in Northern California, I have the privilege of speaking with and encouraging many people who have unwanted same-sex attraction, who are walking out their faith. I see my role as a pastor as one who affirms an individual's personhood and offers understanding while gently pointing to Jesus, who loves us all unconditionally. I provide a safe space for people to question their sexuality with the possibility of turning away from LGBTQ. In the midst of this type of environment, one can receive healing to overcome the effects of lifelong rejection, relational breakdowns, emotional pain, sometimes abuse or trauma, self-condemnation or self-hatred, all with the effect of bringing a fresh self-understanding or a different way forward, a vision for a different future. The existence of our grassroots movement proves that this network, or that this approach, this approach can result in fulfilling lifelong, lasting change. So I want to talk about some of these individuals. If you go to our website at changedmovement.com, you'll see mostly stories. We mostly want to tell the stories of men and women who have left LGBTQ behind. There are dozens of them. And every week on our Instagram site, we publish new stories. It's stories like Kathy Grace Duncan, who lived as a man for 11 years before, through her faith, she began questioning the decisions that came into her decision to become transgender, identified as a man. So she lived so many years as a man, but now she's detransitioned. She lives as a woman, and she leads women's ministries. Or my friend David Reese, who, when he began questioning his sexuality, that is, when he decided that he didn't really want to be gay, he wasn't a Christian. He didn't become a Christian until long after he began searching out counseling options that supported his desires to change. Or David Rasmussen, who was in a marriage and lived an illicit secret life as a gay man for years before telling his wife and going to counseling so that he could save his marriage and his family. So these friends of mine are vitally important to this conversation. Therapy bans threaten the lives of individuals like us, whether minors or adults, who are in pain. Let me just say that again. We are in pain over our LGBTQ feelings. And so as a result, we seek support to diminish the feelings. Bans cause harm because they don't ever allow you to address the pain. They disallow personal exploration with a professional to address the factors that could be formative in the development of same-sex sexual behavior. LGBTQ identifying people must have the right to follow their faith wholeheartedly and pursue their own life goals, even when it means moving away from LGBTQ to identify as gender-congruent heterosexual. For most of us at Changed, our religious convictions fundamentally guide our worldview and sense of personal identity. It's important that legislators grasp the gravity of forcing a person with unwanted same-sex attraction, no matter their age, to disavow their religious faith to embrace LGBTQ identity or same-sex feelings or behavior. In thinking about all the ways I could bring to light the pastoral needs of this community, I thought I would just start with my own story, my own testimony. I first began questioning my sexual identity at 16, when I entered a relationship with another woman that lasted several years. But in my 20s, following social norms, I got married to a man. Unfortunately, very quickly after this, I had a mental breakdown, and I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1. At the time, I reasoned that efforts to force myself into this heterosexual marriage were fundamental to my distress, and so I divorced my husband and I came out as a lesbian. I continued in psychotherapy, punctuated by several hospitalizations, until I was nearly 40. Had you asked me in my 20s, I would have said that the gay community kept me alive. But I also had a deep love of theology, and as Michael said, I went to seminary openly lesbian. In 2000, that was relatively rare. So I was one of a handful of students in my seminary that were openly out. And together we were searching for ways to bring the gay community into the church. Because we had been born gay, because we believed we had been born gay, we thought there was only one way to do that, and that was to change doctrine, to change our understanding of Scripture. And so when I graduated from seminary, I entered into parish ministry. And in that setting, I was exposed to other vibrant expressions of Christianity. And in the next years, I spent ways discovering the new presence of the Lord that I saw in my new peers. Through prayer, I developed a fresh and life-giving perspective of my faith that began to bring me peace. And this is significant. It brought me peace from the distress of bipolar disorder. I came to believe that God knew me uniquely and that he loved me deeply, that he had meaning and purpose for my life. And with that relational framework, that is the framework of relationship between me and my God, and the caring Christian community that I was surrounded with, I rediscovered the sexual ethic of the Bible. I began to recognize that lesbianism had given meaning and purpose to my life over and above my religious convictions, and that caused an internal crisis. I felt it was inconsistent with the demands of Christian faith. And like many of my former LGBTQ friends, my faith gave me a reason to question the assumptions I had made about my sexual orientation. I would never have done that had I not moved from seminary into parish ministry. Faith became a guiding factor in my sense of identity, and my behaviors began to change. I also reevaluated in that setting the degree to which formative experiences had shaped my sense of identity and well-being. In the context of safe and loving relationship with God and those around me, I confronted trauma and abuse that had never been addressed in all the years of psychotherapy that I had. I couldn't have done that without the assistance and guidance of experienced pastors and ministry leaders who affirmed my identity as a woman and my goals to overcome my now unwanted same-sex attraction. Within 6 years of my graduation, all symptoms of bipolar disorder had gone into remission. I gradually ceased taking the multiple medications that I had used to manage those symptoms. At the same time, my experiences of same-sex sexual attraction also began to diminish. I entered into a relationship with a man and we eventually married, and as Mike said, I've been married to him for 16 years. Over half of my adult life was dominated by bipolar disorder. My longest hospitalization was 30 days because of extreme suicidal distress. At one time, I was a candidate for electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. In fact, the longer I underwent psychiatric care for the disorder, the more unhealthy I became. Recall that I identified as a lesbian during all that time. In all of this, the confusion and the underlying pain of my experience of my sexual identity was never analyzed. It wasn't until my faith encouraged me to question the foundational beliefs and potential formative experiences underlying my lesbian identity that I began to experience relief from the emotional pain. I can't help but believe that dismissing the underlying issues that informed my sense of sexual identity caused me great harm. I sometimes ask myself what might have happened if a trusted adult or pastor had allowed me to process my sexual feelings about my close friend when I was 16 in a way that didn't presume I was a lesbian. I might have realized then, as I do now, the extent to which those feelings pointed to larger issues that needed resolution. Perhaps I might have avoided all those years of unsuccessful psychotherapy. I don't think I can begin to tell you the gravity of that conclusion. Shouldn't minors be allowed that chance? And in an era when gender identity has such high stakes, pointing to life-altering drugs and surgeries that frequently cause sterilization, shouldn't children be given every opportunity for self-discovery and relief from trauma that might alleviate gender dysphoria? At Changed, we believe it's important to create opportunities to unravel all that pain that accompanies unwanted same-sex sexual orientation or gender confusion. Pastoral care and counseling provides a vital, safe space to explore one's identity in the context of their faith. People like us at Changed want answers about the life-dominating experience. saying I was born that way, it just doesn't cut it. It doesn't explain it. It's not an idea that holds up to science, as we've heard already. Great harm is coming to people like me, who in the secular world are turning to the secular world for understanding, but yet the secular world is denying all the science that you've heard this morning. And then promoting behaviors that are increasing incidences of syphilis or AIDS, STDs, and even suicidality is increasing. We want to be able to question the formative experiences of our lives. We want to be able to understand ourselves and move forward. And so we don't want to dismiss childhood experiences, ACEs, or sexual abuse. And for women, it includes appreciating the degree to which sexual assault and rape have driven us to the safety of another woman's arms rather than being able to approach opposite-sex relationship. So let me say again, LGBTQ identifying people deserve the right to follow their religious convictions wholeheartedly, to pursue their own life goals, even if it means moving away from LGBTQ. In closing, I just want to introduce Ken Williams. And so maybe we could bring Ken up. Oh, quick change. So you were unprepared for that. Ken Williams and I first met at Bethel Church in Reading about 5 years ago. And as we were getting to know each other, we met with a mutual friend. All three of us had never met, or at least I had never met, anyone else who had left LGBTQ behind. And we spent a year every week talking about the experience of leaving LGBTQ. What was it like? How did God do that? And at the end of that time, we felt that we could establish a ministry supporting others like us, and that was Equipped to Love. And so, Michael, were you going to introduce Ken? I'll let you take that over.
Ken, we almost had it in the bag where you were going to be able to come to London, but then it just didn't work out in the end. But at some point, we really need you here. Reverend Ken Williams is a licensed pastor in California, co-founder of the Change Movement, formerly suicidal over what he felt like a gay orientation. Reverend Williams is an author, a lecturer, and a minister helping others navigate LGBTQ issues with Christian care. He's also an ardent defender of the rights to conscience, particularly to determine one's own sexuality apart from government restriction. As such, Reverend Williams has testified in numerous legislative hearings and briefings internationally. He has been married to his wife since 2006. They have 4 children together. Change Movement is a network of people who have left LGBTQ behind because they wanted to. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate it. It's a real honor to be here. I'm among esteemed guests. When governments propose legislation or rulings like the one being considered in the UK, it obviously gets people's attention if you're somebody with a story like mine, because I don't know where I would be if mandates had been in place when I was seeking help. So thank you for your time today. As Dr. Davidson said, I've been a pastor in Northern California for 15 years, and it's my privilege for these last 5 or 6 years to spend full time helping minister to people that are impacted by LGBTQ. These are the people I can most relate to in the world. I know the pain of being labeled or of being unsure of identity and clamoring for that, and not really easily finding any allies that can really understand exactly what you're going through. And so we minister to people all throughout that spectrum. And as was shared, I co-lead a couple of ministries with Elizabeth. It's my honor to do that. I'll tell just a little bit about my story, and then want to kind of share what we've experienced, that others experience in their journeys as well, and some different ways that people are ministered to that really has brought great fulfillment and freedom in their lives. So I was a church kid. I was raised in church from the time I was born, and found faith in Jesus Christ as my personal Savior when I was 8 years old. Had I think a pretty typical childhood for the most part. I was teased and bullied a bit by other boys, mostly because I was the skinny, scrawny, short boy, which most boys are not looking to be the shortest and scrawniest, but I was that kid. And so, it was difficult to keep up with the other boys. They were bigger and stronger and faster, and I got tired of being the one who couldn't keep up. I got tired of the constant comparison, and so was in some pain over that. And then when I was also around 8 years old, I was exposed to hardcore gay pornography. I was in a field playing with a few other boys, and one of them opened up a boot box, and inside was hardcore gay pornography. And if you've never seen gay pornography before, then or if you've never lived that life yourself, you probably have no awareness of some things that go on behind that door. But what I witnessed was not merely, the male-male version of a sexual loving relationship. What I witnessed was men degrading each other, defiling each other. I saw vile things that is much, much farther than merely two people interacting sexually. And that further wounded my perspective on masculinity. I could not understand why a person would treat another person that way. And then as I grew older, then into my early teens, I just was having more and more reasons, it felt like, to push my masculinity away. Basically, I didn't esteem it. From having not measured up to the other boys, from witnessing those vile acts, and from not feeling like the other boys really got me. I felt like I was more creative and more expressive. I wanted to talk deeply. I believe I was called to be a pastor from birth, and so I wanted to connect emotionally, and most of the boys my age were not interested in that. But I'll tell you, the point at which I first experienced same-sex attraction came directly after that exposure to the gay pornography, because what that catalyzed was for a couple of the other boys to initiate sex play. So my first sexualization was at the hands of a male, not a female. And I had deep shame and self-hatred over that, because even though no one ever told me anything, about sexual interactions or anything like that, I knew it was wrong. It felt really wrong to me to be interacting that way, as an 8-year-old, certainly, and with other boys. And so that shame marred me, and that experience, that sexualization, traumatized me. And I remember when I would show up at that friend's house, ever after that, I remember I'm just going to be real and a little bit graphic, because this is, legislation like this dramatically impacts a person's life like mine, and the public needs to understand what this means. So, I remember then every time I would show up at that friend's house, I would be sexually aroused upon arriving, because even as an 8-year-old, I had been sexualized in a way that people should not be. this dramatically impacted my view of myself. It impacted who I thought I was, because then in the following years, what I would understand would be messaging, even in the 80s, that, oh, well, if this is how you feel, then this is who you are. And there was no talk of, well, and there still isn't today, of, well, I wonder if it's the things that happened to you and your understanding of what happened to you and why that maybe caused beliefs to get rooted and therefore desires to emerge out of that. And I can take you all the way from from about 8 years old all the way up until after college and look at my school pictures, and whoever was the strongest, most successful, kindest young man in my class is the one that I would fixate on. And I would develop a codependent fixation on them. And the only way that I would feel somewhat whole or like I knew who I was if I was getting affirmation from them. I believe that what happened for me was my disdain for masculinity due to the insults that happened to me caused me to push my masculinity away. And the fact is, I was born with XY chromosomes. I was born male. And so when you push away your maleness and yet you're born male, you're pushing part of yourself away. So I was trying to find myself in the more impressive looking, kind male, a version of masculinity that maybe I could respect if they were kind. And so I was looking for me in him, and I would do that just obsessively. I remember I would stalk certain guys. I mean, I would be parked outside their house at midnight as a 16, 17-year-old, just wanting to be closer to them, because that's the only way I felt okay with me, is if I was somewhat close to this person who defined me. And this was all sexualized, because remember, my first sexualization was at the hands of a male and at an early age. So by the time I ended up having some sexual interactions with a few boys in my teens, and that was deeply traumatic because it went against my faith convictions and it didn't scratch the itch. I still didn't know who I was the minute after they left my house. We would have some kind of a sexual interaction. They leave. Now I'm feeling destitute again. I'm feeling emotionally bankrupt. And so it was, it never scratched the itch. And so eventually I became suicidal over this as a 17-year-old. I was just exhausted from the trauma of wanting to find out who I was and nothing ever working, and then the guilt of acting against my faith convictions. So eventually wrote out 9 pages of my hate, anger, pain, handed it to my youth pastor. My youth pastor said, we're going to tell your parents, which was the right move. He knew my parents. My parents cried with me for 2 hours. They were so devastated that I had been so wounded and hopeless and depressed and suicidal under their roof, and hadn't felt safe to share it with them. And so we cried together for a couple of hours. They said, what do you want? I said, I don't want this life, but that's all I'm attracted to. So I started seeing a Christian psychologist, Dr. Paul Schmidt from New Life Counseling Center in Louisville, Kentucky. And I saw him weekly for 5 years. And I'm telling you what, that was the last moment that I was suicidal. Now, my first moment of being suicidal was after I had gone into a Christian bookstore to see if they had any resource when I was 17 that would help me address my unwanted same-sex attraction, and there were none. So my first feelings of suicidality were leaving the Christian bookstore because I couldn't find any resource to help me in my faith journey with my sexuality. But he did. And he spent so much time with me just like showing me love, just showing me the unconditional love of God. He would say, Ken, you wouldn't understand grace if it hit you across the face. You've got to understand that Jesus forgives anything that we feel guilty about. And he got me into a support group, which I paid for and was happy to do it. And I finally found people who I could relate to. Like, I wasn't alone, and my secrets were safe with him. And I found this group of people who had a similar life experience. So I was never suicidal after this. I also came across David Seaman's book, Healing for Damaged Emotions, and he was just down the way from me at Asbury Theological Seminary in Kentucky. I was living in Kentucky at the time, and from reading that book and then processing with my psychologist, he helped me realize, I began to realize I was carrying a lot of relational, pain and rejection pain, trauma from the porn and the sexualization as an 8-year-old. So I had major unforgiveness issues. I basically hated any strong male. I actually felt it was wrong for any male to possess any strength because I felt it was so oppressive. And so in my narcissism, I determined that I would be better than all the other males. And this, of course, separated me from other people because when you're narcissistic and prideful, people don't want to be around that. So it became a very lonely place. But I began to feel loved by my psychologist and by God eventually, and then by others. My psychologist encouraged me to join a Christian fraternity, and that was one of the best things that could have ever happened because I had these typical men who accepted me just as I was. Even though I was quirky, they accepted me and they showed me love. And so that began to erase those misunderstandings in my mind about how I was this different version of masculinity than they were. And then I started just pouring myself into more of reading the Bible and pursuing God in prayer and in worship on my own. And I saw in the Bible that God didn't label people as gay or straight. He just labeled them male or female. And so what did that mean for me? Because I had been hungry to know that I measured up as a man for years, but my own self-perspective had disallowed that. But these men in my church and my fraternity, mentors that came along, helped me to see and embrace my own masculinity and eventually to be able to bond with the other males, and that started changing my perspectives. So this was an ongoing journey. I just kept pursuing emotional healing, and it was prayer ministers, it was counselors and pastors and friends that did the ministry here. So I began to forgive others. I repented for my judgment of others and for stereotyping all strong men as evil. I no longer saw gay as an accurate representation of who I was. I basically began to be able to embrace Jesus's love for me, imperfect as I was, and to start to love myself. And I just began to believe that God wasn't condemning me, but that he was actually wanting me to find my deepest self. And that's what the journey was that I was on. And so over time, through just everything that, going on in my life that I've described to you, I began to see that my fixation on men started to dissipate. My objectification of them, my undressing them with my eyes started to fall away. Porn and masturbation fell away dramatically. Those were my pain medication, my emotional pain medication, and those started to fall away. And I eventually began to embrace my masculinity. And this didn't happen overnight, it happened over years, but it happened. And my sexual arousals, to my shock, dramatically changed. To the point that I began to notice in my early 30s, this girl in my young adults group, and that I had been developing a friendship with, and I became attracted to her. And I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna speed it up. But basically, I fell in love with her. I thought she was beautiful on the inside and the out, and been married to her for 15 years. We have 4 children together. I no longer do porn or masturbation. I have rich friendships with heterosexual men. I have pleasurable sex without the fear of HIV, a sexually transmitted infection, or damaging my body by sex acts that biologically a body is not designed for. And following Christian faith has been life-giving and fulfilling for me, greatly so. I want to mention one of my friends who had been married to he's been married to his wife for 50 years, but lived a gay lifestyle. And he was at a gay bar one night, and this man came up to him and said, "I'll give you $20 to have sex with me." And my friend said no, because he wasn't attracted to him. And the man said back to him, "Well, I'll give you $20 for a hug." Do you understand that so much of homosexuality is emotional pain presenting as a need that gets sexualized. And so sex doesn't cure that. You can have as much sex as you want, but if the need is an emotional wounding or a trauma or an abandonment, that doesn't scratch the itch. I mean, I have a friend a member of our team who was in a lesbian life for 6.5 years, but went to church with her girlfriend, felt led to go down for prayer by herself during a time of worship and ministry, and felt impact by the Lord. She felt touched by the Lord, and the same-sex attraction left her in that moment. And she has been out of that life now for 9 years and is attracted to men. This was just by availing herself of being in a Christian atmosphere where she was seeking to connect with God. So we help. That's one of the ways we minister to people, is we help them to go pursue their own relationship with God. Another friend of mine who I minister to was sexually aroused by men 20 to 30 years older than him, even as a teen or a man in his early 20s. And he then began to realize that, well, the abandonment he experienced by his own father had become sexualized. That's why he was searching. He was searching for a daddy, but it had become sexualized, and that the ways that the porn that he had viewed as a child had caused him to compare his own genitalia to these male models. As he's a boy, he's comparing his male genitalia to the men in the pornography that he was watching, and he felt like he didn't measure up as a male. And then the abandonment by his father and all that put together caused him to feel like he was needing a male and needing a daddy, someone to kind of complete him and all that, but it became sexualized. These are the things that we owe it to people to create a safe space to let them say what it is that they're feeling and why. Why have they come to feel these ways? So that is literally what we do, is we create that space where people can say absolutely anything, be totally transparent, and we help connect them to a loving God who has grace for whatever they're dealing with. And then we seek God's counsel on, when is the first time that you started to feel this way? Okay, what was happening, and what did you come to believe about yourself in that moment? And then we seek God for, okay, is that the truth of their life? This way that they came to feel about themselves, is that reality, or is that merely an assumption that they made based on life experiences or their environment around them? And so often people start to realize, wow, I have been defined by things that don't necessarily accurately define me. And as anybody would know, with any background in faith or in counseling or anything like that, who we believe we are has everything to do with how we will behave. And I just am an advocate for the fact that people should have the right to get counseling and make personal life changes that bring them peace and happiness. Like, it's no business of the government to mandate how individuals should identify sexually. This should be up to the individual to do with their counselor, with their pastor, to find self-understanding and healing for anything that ails them. Thank you so much for your time.
And just because of time, we're not going to have questions now, but that was so moving and so forthright and so clear. We're really thankful for that, and Elizabeth, for your contribution. Folks, I'm going to suggest that we do not do the session dealing with the government's ban on conversion therapy that goes both ways. It's just not something that I think we should do now. I'm going to suggest you take a 5-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll do the last 2 sessions, and then I think we'll be on time. It's really important that we close at 5 o'clock and we're out of the building by 5:30. So could we do it that way? I beg your understanding for that, and apologies for those who have prepared for that panel discussion. Thank you. Just take 5 minutes, please, folks. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
All the way from Norway. I know you have a keen interest in all of this. Could you just introduce yourself, Ole? Tell us what's happening in Norway, and then I'd love to hear from Roger. Tell us, Ole, where you are and what it is that is motivating you at the moment in this area.
Thank you, Mike. I'm a lawyer, litigator, but I'm also the chairman of Til Helhet, which is a ministry for people coming out of the gay lifestyle. In Norway, there's been put forward a similar proposition for a ban against so-called conversion therapy, a similar one as that you have in the UK. They originally said that it would be a ban for minors only, or if there's been some sort of coercion. But after the election in September, a new government came in and they want to make it a lot wider ban, probably a total ban. We don't know yet. So you can say that's what motivates me right now is to follow this closely and to speak out wherever I can against this, because it really is such a pivotal point for Christians and for people believing in the right to freedom in this area.
Well, it's going to be really helpful, I think, if you interact with the other lawyers here today, Ole. So thank you very much for being here. Roger, could you introduce yourself and tell us what's in your mind around this issue, if you would?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Roger Kiska. I'm legal counsel for the Christian Legal Center. And my background is European Court of Human Rights case law, which would in the UK be Human Rights Act law, which is part of the analysis which the government has to undertake to determine whether any proposed ban would be law compliant, both regarding restrictions on the various freedoms we enjoy, as well as equality considerations. And for me, this is an issue of not only freedoms, legal freedoms, but also of the gospel. And any ban would have significant implications on a lot of things, including the ability of churches to preach, in my estimation anyways, on prayer ministries, on pastoral care. It would do damage to the gospel in the sense that those who want to repent from what they deem to be, the sin of homosexual behavior, they will not have outlets to do that. And for me, that's a very serious thing as a Christian and as a lawyer.
Thank you, Roger. And Michael, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, my name's Michael Phillips. I'm counsel with the Christian Legal Center, and I've worked with them now for the better part of probably about 10 years or so, initially helping street preachers and that kind of thing when they get arrested. And very frequently it's when they go out on the streets and say things which are critical of other religions, but increasingly talking about gender identity issues, and also homosexuality. And more recently, just assisting Mike in one of his cases in Northern Ireland, where he was a victim of cancel culture. He had his bank cancelled, and we're taking the bank to court in Northern Ireland, and also assisting therapists. There's a case I'm dealing with at the moment, which is sub judice. It's being considered. But therapists are now getting themselves into trouble in terms of allegations being made against them for really just doing their work. And people research them online, on social media, and they say, oh, you're friends with this person or that person, and then make assumptions about the therapist. That's a real risk that some therapists have. And even if what they've said is completely and utterly anodyne and cultural and appropriate, but it goes against maybe some aspect of another person's culture, then you can find yourself before your professional body potentially facing strike-off from your profession.
Thank you, Michael. And Richard, please introduce yourself.
I'm Richard O'Dare, consultant at the Christian Legal Centre, and I recently came into the centre, and I've been spending a lot of time working on with Mike on related legal issues of the kind you've been discussing today. So it sort of comes out of my ears, really, this sort of stuff. And lots of things to say, but I'll keep my powder dry, as it were, for the moment.
Well, maybe don't keep your powder dry in terms of what you see the threat of a ban as you see outworked from the Memorandum of Understanding already and the emerging threat of a conversion therapy ban. Where do you see that leading in terms of law?
Well, I think that unless there is a great work of God, we are going to see, which there may well be, but it doesn't always happen exactly as we want it, as we know. There's going to be basically a ban on such therapy for the under 18s, and for the over 18s, it's going to be allowed, provided, and this is a big proviso, that there is informed consent and warnings are given about all the risks. There's a lot of ideology in those phrases. So that's a very serious infringement on personal autonomy. Roger probably wants to say some more about this, but Article 8 of the Human Rights Act allows us all the right to develop our lives, subject to limitations obviously, in the way we want, to make of our lives the story that we want to write. That's the basic idea. Why should that not be given to those who are over 18, except subject to these big limitations, and why should it be taken altogether from those who are under 18? And we all know what the arguments are, and there is no good justification for that. And it's important to remember that under the Human Rights Act, when your rights are engaged, which they clearly are here, the state has to provide weighty justifications for taking them away. So it's a little bit of ambiguity here and there in the research literature is not enough. The state have got to show. And in my view, they will struggle to do so. And I think that, and this is not legal centre policy, but my initial idea at the moment is that this may be an occasion to go for what we call a declaration of incompatibility. That is, if the legislation comes out in its current form. So if they take away from the under 18s the right to have this kind of therapy, we could potentially bring a JR saying it's a breach of Article 8. No justification for that. And again, when you look at the over 18s, we'll have to look at those warnings very carefully. Are they going to be, as I suspect they are, fundamentally biased, and therefore, in effect, taking away the right to autonomy by, in a sense, scaring them off? So there are some big issues here. I think the other thing I want to say is at the other end of the spectrum, perhaps in terms of seriousness, but important nonetheless, is even leaving aside the big issues of policy, there is some very bad law-making going on here. Just to give you an example, you look at the consultation paper and you ask, what is conversion therapy? What do they mean? Well, you know, it's not exactly clear, is it? I mean, we can debate what they mean, but it's nowhere is it set out. And yet this is an uncertainty about the definition of something which will be a significant criminal offence. Yet again, what about professional self-regulation? Why on earth, in a world in which we value freedom from government interference, are we proposing to jump from a situation in which there is no regulation at all of most therapists to one in which if they get it wrong, they're going to be in jail? It's extraordinary in terms of law-making process.
Yes, I suppose I want to say that just as Caroline Peller said very clearly, science is actually following the culture. We often think that science is independent. We often think that somehow the law is independent. But in fact, the law and professional regulation also follows the culture. And it's really why it's very important in law and in science to continue to contend and take every avenue that you can for that which actually is just honest, that which is for freedom, that which actually keeps the doors open. There is, but Richard is quite right, there is no legal definition that we can understand what they say it means, but there is no obvious definition, certainly something that would pass muster in terms of legal definition around what conversion therapy is. So the way in which people are responding to the consultation is according to the understanding of the culture. So although we can look at it very specifically, and we ourselves might respond to it very specifically in terms of what the words say, what the culture understands conversion therapy to be, and what the narrative of what conversion therapy is it remains something very difficult, what the political class say that it is. Furthermore, there is simply no need for it. Anything that might be physically harmful in any way is already caught by criminal legislation. And I know what Richard was saying in terms of professional regulation, and this will get worse. But I'm sitting here with two therapists that are in this room. One of them is Leslie Pilkington, who was our very first case of a therapist who was subject to an investigative journalist hit, and where she gave him the therapy that he wanted. He recorded the sessions, reported her to her professional body, and had her removed in effect, when the therapy that she was giving him was exactly what he wanted and was good therapy. So, in effect, what we've had is a professional regulatory ban in any event. And for the men and women that want to practice this, they have in fact been barred from the practice of it in any event. So the idea that this is going to be codified further with a criminal aspect to it will mean that people like Leslie don't just lose their license, but will find themselves labelled a criminal. And can I also say this, and then I'll hand back to Michael, and then we can go to Michael Phillips. The LGBT lobby came against Mike Davidson and Core Issues Trust with a Twitter campaign during a Pride Month, and got his bank account shut down by requesting it because they said he was a conversion therapist and was hateful and not fit to be in the public domain. They get his iZettle account unilaterally cancelled because I am associated, I receive back-to-back phone calls for 3 days in a row, some of them threatening death and other horrible, nasty things. Mike gets threatening phone calls onto his phone line. Now, we get the reason why this place, we kept it so secret, because such is the culture that we know, because this has happened to us over and over again, that when we publicize a location, people will complain about the opposition to the work that Mike does and the work that we do. Will call the location, frighten the location, and have us removed from the location. And this has not happened just once, it's happened many times, in fact. We're not even talking just once or twice. We're talking every time we go to Oxford or to Cambridge and run an education academy. We're talking whenever we try to run a conference such as this. We are actually removed from places that we ought to be free to access. So these are fundamental freedoms to associate, to access, to speak, that are being removed from us, from a certain class, from a certain group of people. Michael?
Yeah, and so I think one of the difficulties is that not necessarily always what the law says or what a professional regulator says, it's what actually people believe. And so sometimes you might ask the question, in some of the cases that I've been involved with, what is your understanding of some of these topics? And people will give you their definition and say, well, that's all very interesting, but in fact, let's actually look at the definition. And the definition is actually completely different to what they believe. You know, that's their own definition, the authority's definition. And so what is happening is this, is that culture will then run on with these particular beliefs and ideologies fueled by what they see in the media and so on. And so then, in response to that, the therapists, the counselors, and sometimes even people talking about these subjects in their workplace are then so full of fear that they're going to get into trouble, that they're going to get the sack, they're going to lose their job, that they might get arrested, that they might be struck off, because of what they believe is the situation either legally or by the professional regulator, and it isn't. And you think, the best example that I've known over the last 10 years is with the police. I mean, you would think that the police know the law, wouldn't you? But they don't, believe it or not. And very often when people say things in the street, we've seen this so many times, that they believe it's a crime if you upset people. And then not only do they falsely believe that, but in fact, even the higher echelons of the police will promulgate this idea that to offend is an offence. And so these are the kinds of issues. And so I think part of our job is not just obviously fighting these battles in the court and in the media, but to also empowering individuals to say, no, why don't you actually look up what the law says? Why don't you actually look up what the professional regulator says? I'm allowed to do this, actually, you know. There's nothing that prevents me from doing this. And even under the current memorandum of understanding, it's arguable that Mike isn't doing anything wrong, you know. He's never been prosecuted for anything. And so he's still a regulated charity. So the thing is this, is that there's a lot of hot air that kind of blows around as to, you know, this is a conversion therapist and they cause people to commit suicide and all the rest of it. And then when you actually say, well, what, you know, could we see some evidence? What's the authority for that? Where are the people that apparently Mike Davidson has done this to? You know, where are the people in the graves? And they go, well, actually, maybe they don't exist because it's not true. And so I think a lot of it is bullying tactics, and you have to, whoever the authority is or the individual, you have to stand up to them and say, no, what is your evidence for that?
Roger, could I ask you and Ole perhaps to comment a bit more broadly in terms of Europe? Are you able to give us some perspective there?
Sure, I'll begin if that's okay, Ole. First of all, again, the point that this law, at least as framed in the consultation, is not prescribed within the meaning of the Human Rights Act. That is a pretty specific requirement, that you have to have a law that's clear, concrete, foreseeable. That's a big issue, because as it stands, you know, we had a case with a social worker where counsel for the other side actually said that in today's England, Mother Teresa wouldn't be fit to be a social worker. Well, under this proposed consultation, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung would be conversion therapists, and C.S. Lewis, you know, with his pastoral remarks on homosexual behavior and sexuality within marriage and the purpose of sex and sexuality, might be deemed conversion therapy as well. So it's all very muddied. And the basis that we're seeing in the consultation is Article 3 of the Convention, which is a prohibition on torture and degrading and inhuman treatment, and Article 8, which is the right to privacy. Now, Article 3, as Andrea helpfully mentioned, that's already caught under criminal law. So if there's someone using violent tactics to engage in their therapy, that's already caught in the criminal law. So, you know, Article 3 with reference to what IFTCC, Core Issues Trust, Mike Davidson does is wholly irrelevant, because that's not even within the ballpark. Now, the court has held that in some situations, Article 8, the right to privacy, there can be a positive obligation on the government to protect people from harm, but that threshold is incredibly high. incredibly high. And so there would have to be, at a minimum, a case-by-case analysis. You couldn't have a blanket ban. So as Richard was saying, that this would stand a good chance of being struck down if it was judicially reviewed.
Yeah, yeah, I can echo that, and I think what gives me a little hope is that from when I read what the prosecution lawyers in Norway are saying about the proposal, they're basically saying this is very hard for us to, in practice, in real life, to go after, because first of all, it's the definition of conversion therapy is up in the air. It's not accurate enough to qualify as a standard for a punishment. And the other thing is the European Convention on Human Rights. Not only the right to privacy, but also the right to free speech, the freedom of conscience and religion, and also the right to form a family, which basically, this is a question of autonomy, which several of you have mentioned, that if a person wants to pursue a life that is by that person's own choice, that person shouldn't be hindered, because we're talking about a minority within a minority here. And I think more and more people are beginning to see that aspect. However, this is highly, it's a hot potato in Norway right now, and it's just getting hotter.
Just thought it would be good to mention, in the light of that, one of the things which, for me, is the most staggering thing about the legislation, and which, if we live in a half-sane world, should bring it down, which is this. If you're under 18, apparently, you do not have sufficient understanding and autonomy to consent to therapy of this kind. That's the point. That's what the under 18 ban means. But if you're under 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, you know where I'm going, don't you? You do have power to consent to surgery, which will change your life forever. I mean, how can that be rational lawmaking? I just don't understand. If it is, I'm going to give up. Not really.
There is a saying that says, by being here today, we certify our sanity. By actually saying these things out loud and having people that agree with what you said, that sounds insane, and we all say that does sound insane, therefore we're not insane. Because if a culture becomes insane, if law promotes something that is incongruent and smacks of something that is insane, as this is, because it doesn't protect our children, and simply makes no sense, then there's a sense in which being together shows that we have something to say that speaks sense.
And that's why I want to really honor the Christian Legal Center and Christian Concern for daring to associate with the IFTCC and the likes of Core Issues Trust and all of the organizations that are represented here today. Because it really, I think, is important that we have done what we have done by investing to the extent that we have in this little time today, this symposium. But I'm going to suggest now that the lawyers stay where they are. And Ole, if you have the time to stay with us, would you please? And Roger. And I'm going to ask the other speakers to come up and bring a chair. And then I'm going to ask the audience, if you have questions, comments, concerns, could we have the mics, or I'll surrender this mic and we'll use one mic up here. If there are final questions or issues you want to raise, would you do that now? Where is Andre? Yes, certainly, Andre. And Elizabeth. Yeah, may as well. or if you feel more comfortable sitting down below, that's fine. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
Caris?
I would just like to make a few comments about consent in the government consultation, adult consent this is. So they say that it needs to be robust. And an example of robust consent would be written consent. Now, I personally think that is, you know, a potentially good standard that every therapist or practitioner should be implementing, certainly in this area. However, there's a huge legal can of worms that are opened up by this idea that an adult can consent if they are not vulnerable. Well, who decides who is vulnerable? Because this is a population that evidently does have a lot of vulnerability. The LGBT as a population, as a group, is known for its vulnerabilities because of its higher mental health problems. And this is a subset of that group, and we can extrapolate that their vulnerabilities are equally weighty. So imagine if a member of the family of the person pursuing the therapy complains to the police and saying, this person has adult learning disabilities, they can't consent. The police will be investigating within minutes. Another alternative scenario is the person goes through the therapy, they don't feel it's produced any outcomes that they want, they then get resentful, and then they say, well, I couldn't consent, it was all a sham.
So. I would like to respond. Thank you. A law like this would make anyone who has same-sex attraction or congruent identity a potentially dangerous client. It makes them a high-risk clients. Therefore, therapists will avoid risk. It's not going to help them get therapy. It's going to work against all of them, regardless of their therapy goal at all. And regarding consent, I want to bring up this case. I heard the testimony of Erin Brewer that she gave before the Select Committee of the New Zealand Parliament. Erin testified that when she was a young girl, she was raped. And she believed that had she been a boy, this would not have happened to her. And after she was raped, she believed she was a boy. She says she truly believed she was a boy. But her school psychologist looked in on what was happening to her because she was acting like an aggressive boy with the girls. So her school psychologist looked in on what was happening to her, investigated, found the trauma, treated the trauma, and helped her feel good about being a girl. Now, Erin did not initiate this therapy. She didn't give some kind of consent to it. I don't know that how much her parents even knew about it. But she was not questioning her gender identity. She was not asking for help to explore her gender identity. She would not have had the understanding to have asked for this therapy at her age. Her school psychologist simply saw this child, looked in on what was happening to her, found the trauma, treated the trauma, and helped her feel good about being a girl. I think this would be against the law under this ban. Certainly, no therapist would take the risk of helping her. And if she had lived today, she would have been affirmed that she is a boy. She would have been introduced to her peers as a boy. She would be allowed to dress and have pronouns at school without her parents' knowledge if she wished. At least in California, that's what would happen. And she would be heading down the conveyor belt to being sterilized for life and losing capacity for sexual pleasure for life and being on wrong sex hormones, body-damaging and harming treatments that do not affect, will not relieve psychological stress or suicidality for life.
And we have with our cases teachers that already lose their jobs for sharing concerns around the curriculum and how the transgender, the sexual ethics are taught in schools. So school counsellors are losing their jobs, teachers are losing their jobs, just for sharing these positions. Parents that express concerns around children that are transgendering as young as 6 in the classroom are the ones that end up leaving the school, homeschooling their children. So we already have a situation. Whereby people are exiting the space. So that's a current lived reality. Imagine this, a conversion therapy ban on counsellors or into the church context, in pastoral context. Imagine the idea of consent and what that means. What in fact will happen is that a whole lot of people will just go silent, because how you do real discipleship, how you do real care, is you take risks and you speak into people's lives and you meet them at vulnerable points in their lives and you look after them and you love them and you walk alongside them taking risks. You don't get out of form. You don't ask them to sign on a dotted line. That's not how real life works. But when there's an act that comes in and subdues free discourse, subdues how you naturally interact pastorally and professionally, there will be a whole lot of chilling and a very easy way of targeting actually those that seek to do the good, which is exactly what Leslie Pilkington was doing all those years ago, is exactly what Mike Davidson does, exactly what a whole lot of people in this room do day in, day out.
Also, because as we're talking about consent, the wider, we've got to understand the influence that the Ozanne Foundation has had on that discussion. As recently as May, Jane Ozanne told the Women and Equalities Committee in the House of Commons that most people, like herself, adults she had met, had freely consented, gone of their own accord to what they call conversion therapy. By early October, the Ozanne Foundation had published a report called the Cooper Report, published by very high-powered human rights lawyers, calling for a criminal ban and surveillance, and denying that it was possible even for adults to give consent. What were they doing there? I think the real object is to stop the work that was being discussed in today's conference. It's not simply to protect the LGBT population or vulnerable people. You've got to understand that.
Thank you.
This is a
question at the back.
Sorry, a question actually mainly to Andrea and other people involved in campaigning in this country, which is, I mean, how much does the government actually want to bring in this legislation? My feeling is, what I've looked at, is that they're not very keen at all. That, why would they want to enter into all the sorts of conflicts that it'll bring? So where is the pressure coming from? Apart from the LGBT community, sort of amorphous mass, how influential, that you mentioned, Carys, has been Jane Ozanne and the motion from the General Synod of the Church of England? And isn't this a paradox that, so many people have mentioned it's their faith which has helped them to transition very often from the LGBT lifestyle, and yet it seems in this country that it's a section of the established church which is really pressing for this legislation.
I think that it's the government following the culture again, and what's happened is that on the ground things have changed, policies have changed within the profession, and the church being singled out, or other institutions being singled out as being homophobic, transphobic, means that they then begin to feel pressure, made to make public statements, are then forced into action. And that's what's happened at this point. They think in order to appease the culture. Richard?
I think it's a very good example of the way 21st century politics work. If you read through the consultation document, I think you can, if you think about it, work out which bits of the document it's talking to, which sections of its supporter base it's talking to at different points. So they're talking to the LGBT bit when they're talking about bans. But then later on they say, oh, no, it has nothing to do with religious conversations and all sorts of stuff. That's because they know there's a right wing in the Conservative Party which is deeply uneasy about this. So actually, it's not a monolithic document at all. It's an attempt to knit together, in my view, different constituencies to which they want to appeal inconsistently at the same time.
Just want to take a little risk to bring up another thought. At least in the United States, some LGBT people have told me they frankly don't care if somebody wants to change. They feel like people have, whatever makes you happy. I frankly don't care. So, I mean, it's not, as far as I can see, at least in the United States, it's not an LGBT issue. It's the militant LGBT people. It's a subsection of this population. What do you think? What do you think in the UK?
There's a question at the back. We'll continue the discussion at the front in a few minutes.
Hello. First question is just, based on the UK government's current proposals, do you actually see the proposals as a win, considering that actually they're only really affecting under 18s? So there's still a huge amount of population that can still get these talking therapies. So that's the first question. Sorry?
That doesn't fly with me, because these things, are used as wedges. And once you get it in there, you can just lever it up year by year and ultimately get what they wanted, which is, the end of appropriate freedom. So, no, there's no concession there in my mind.
I will say that the California experience is that, and I was involved in the first bill ever passed in a state legislature banning this for minors. But what they did in the process was the legislation that was crafted for legislatures by Equality California, it essentially threw everything on the wall, and they wanted to see what stuck. Okay, there was all sorts of things in this originally proposed. What stuck was minors, but there was a lot of other things that are still on the wish list.
If I may, we've seen this clearly in Norway. Sorry. We see this in Norway, that this is just a stepping stone. It's easier to sell a ban for minors, but it didn't take long before they started talking about expanding it to also adults. And they actually were pretty angry about, the LGBTQ movement were pretty angry about it being limited to minors only. And that became, like I said, a stepping stone for them to seek to expand it. And it is the slippery slope, definitely.
And it's not only expanding it with regard to therapy, it's expanding it with regard to speech, freedom of religion. So, in time, in California, we had a bill that was going to make therapy or anyone, helping anyone decrease or change same-sex attraction and congruent gender identity, could be sued for bankruptcy. So basically, they're deputizing the population. Anyone can walk into a church, say, well, I give money to this church, therefore I expect certain things from the pastor and so on. And anyone could sue anyone into bankruptcy. So you have a complete chilling of the entire population. You can't read certain passages of Scripture. You cannot preach the gospel that Jesus Christ changes lives. Given time in the courts, it could ban the Bible. I mean, it's not just about therapy. They're really going after religion.
I would like to speak to this if I could really quick, Andrea. As a pastor, what I've seen with the minor therapy ban in the state of California is the sense that, the ban in California only really directly affects licensed caregivers, licensed therapists. But the impact that has had on the pastoral population is to say, oh, I therefore won't. So, for example, I don't provide any kind of pastoral care for minors out of fear of that risk. But what's happening now, although, it may seem I mean, I think it sounds a little sensationalist to say, oh, it's like the next step there will be. But I do want to say that the federal legislation that's been introduced in this past year does ban so-called conversion therapy for adults. So that it is happening. It's becoming familiarized through minor bans. But then the bill that was introduced in the state of California, to which you reference, was a consumer fraud bill, not directly banning conversion therapy, but instead banning any product or any resource for sale in the state that suggested sexual orientation or gender identity could change. And that was the bill that really sparked the development of the changed movement. And so even with the minor therapy ban that has been in existence for several years in California, that opened the doorway for simply the belief that, oh, now we can publicly declare that no one ever changes and that it's impossible, and to do so, we should suppress any literature, any book, any suggestion that it can.
The select committee in New Zealand was asking people who testified their opinion on whether parents should be punished if they don't support their child's same-sex attraction or transgender identity. Well, Aaron Brewer testified to that committee. What would happen under this issue if parents were being punished? Little Aaron would not dare talk to her parents about what happened to her. She wouldn't dare to say, Mom, Dad, can you help me can you get me help so I cannot feel like a boy and feel happy? And her parents could not have a conversation she couldn't have a conversation with them. They couldn't have a conversation with her. Honey, we'd like you to at least wait till you're 18 to make a decision that's so dramatic. It would chill parent-child conversations in relationship. If they punished Aaron's parents, let's say a parent went to jail, she would experience the absence of a parent, known to be a cause of psychological difficulties in minors. So by punishing her parents, they punish her and further place a vulnerable child at greater risk. So no, we're not happy with this bill, any bill like this, because it's just a step.
Can I just quickly ask a follow-up, if that's okay? It's just about one more question. So for those that are from within your faith who say that your practices are harmful to adults, I mean, we've mentioned Jay Nazan, for instance. What do you think about Jay? Like, what do you think about what she's saying? And should the government also be listening to her, seeing as she is from the same faith?
Well, I'm going to answer that, if you don't mind, Ben, with apologies to the team. I think everybody needs to be able to speak, but we see a systematic close down in terms of anybody who has an alternative narrative. That's why we saw no significant engagement with the media. There may be other issues, but this is what we're talking about. It's this monoculture that forbids any other perspective, any ideological diversity from coming to the party and having the debate. Fair enough if you lose a debate, but if you don't get to really participate in the debate, I think that's what really is very difficult. So thank you so much for those questions. I'm going to ask the X Out Loud people to come, please. And you're going to have the last word today, if that's all right. Could you come? Because this is the generation that we need to hand things on to. And folks, I want you to stand here and look at this group of people, if you would. Come over here, please, Victor. Just face them and look at this group who've assembled. What do you have to say in closing? Give us the closing words that you have on your heart.
For me, I just want to say that change is possible. I'm just as important as somebody from maybe LGBT or somebody who identifies as something else different from my view. And as a member of this society in the UK, If I should need help at any point regarding the journey that I'm on with my sexuality, I should have a right to seek that help.
I want to say thanks to all these people, like they fight for our freedom, because everybody is free to choose. So if I want to counseling, I can get counseling and help. And yeah.
I can't imagine if the minority like me, in future, I can't access this kind of the services. So I can't imagine the other Asian countries, United Kingdoms, they can't access this kind of support. While they, in the Asia country, they used to have this kind of services. So, yeah.
I just want to say thank you to all of you here. I don't feel alone anymore because we have you guys backing us up scientifically and scripturally. And the lawyers, it puts my mind at ease to know that we have a backup. And I want to thank you for showing that interest in our lives, that change is possible. And nobody's interested to hear that side of the story, that these voices exist. But thank you for coming.
I want to say thank you to everyone, all of the speakers today, and for all of your work. And I think it's important that everyone's freedom of expression and conscience and right to self-determination is respected. If you want to live a homosexual lifestyle, that's fine. If you don't, that's also fine. And I think that's what the issue at stake is here.
I just want to say that we love LGBT people. It's not about hatred, and it's never been about that. The thing is that, for example, now I'm in a very good place. I know who I am, and I'm very stable in my identity, but what about those who are not there just yet? So I believe this is important for them. It's not about necessarily us here, even though it will affect us. But what about those teenagers that are so confused about their identities? Why should our stories be silent just because it's not according to some legislation?
So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to close the session. Thank you again for coming, for your investment in time. We will again send out the link if you'd like to access the resources. You're very welcome. Because of copyright, I don't think you should pass them on without permission from us, but otherwise do access them and use them in whatever way you can. Could we have a round of applause for those who have worked today? So thank you very much. We do need to be out of the building by 5:30, and if there is people who can, if the X Out Loudest could help take down the flags and the poles, that would really help us. Thank you.